The potential armed conflict over the status of Taiwan represents perhaps the most complex and multidimensional geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. To understand the mechanics of this looming catastrophe, one must first look at the clock ticking in Beijing. Intelligence assessments and strategic analysis have identified three critical horizons: the year 2027, 2030, and 2049. While 2027 marks the centennial of the People's Liberation Army and the deadline Xi Jinping reportedly set for his military to be capable of invasion, many experts argue this is merely a milestone for technical readiness rather than a fixed date for war. The more dangerous window opens toward 2030. This calculation is driven by irreversible demographics and economics. China's population is aging rapidly, its economic growth is slowing, and Western technological sanctions are beginning to erode its long-term potential. For a leader seeking to immortalize himself alongside Mao Zedong, the window where the military balance is most favorable is closing, making the temptation to act before the decade ends dangerously high. The war likely begins not with a bang, but with a strangulation. Long before the first Marine storms a beach, Beijing would likely initiate a quarantine, an operation dwelling in the gray zone of international law. It would be led not by the gray hulls of the Navy, but by the white hulls of the China Coast Guard and the Maritime Safety Administration. Framing the operation as a law enforcement action, Chinese authorities would demand customs and sanitary declarations from every vessel heading to Taiwanese ports, effectively asserting jurisdiction over the island's waters without immediately firing a shot. This puts the onus of escalation on Washington and Taipei. If an American destroyer breaks the quarantine, Beijing can claim it is the victim of aggression. Simultaneously, an invisible siege would descend upon the island's infrastructure. War games such as the Taiwan digital blockade have exposed the catastrophic vulnerability of the island's energy sector. Taiwan relies on imports for nearly all its energy needs. In a total blockade scenario, its reserves of liquefied natural gas would evaporate in roughly 10 days, its coal in 7 weeks, and its oil in 20. As the lights flicker and fade across Taipei, Chinese cyber warfare units would assault the power grids and air traffic control systems, while deep beneath the ocean surface, cables carrying the internet would be severed by civilian vessels acting as proxies, plunging the island into a terrifying information vacuum. If strangulation fails to force a political capitulation, the doctrine of the People's Liberation Army dictates a shift to kinetic violence, escalating to the Joint Firepower Strike campaign. The opening hours of this phase would likely witness the most intense missile barrage in human history. The PLA rocket force would unleash thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles, targeting command centers, radar arrays, and airfields. Among the most feared weapons in this opening salvo is the PHL-16, a massive truck-mounted launch system capable of firing 370mm guided rockets. With a range of nearly 300 kilometers, these rockets can strike any target in Taiwan directly from the coast of mainland China, saturating the island's defenses with a relentless rain of steel. High above the atmosphere, a silent war would determine the fate of the armies below. The Chinese strategy, known as blinding the eagle, aims to dismantle the orbital eyes and ears of the United States in the first 24 hours. By attacking the satellite constellations that provide early warning and communications, Beijing hopes to paralyze the American command structure, severing the link between the Pentagon and its forces in the Pacific. On the ground, special operations forces, infiltrated days or weeks prior, would emerge from the shadows to conduct decapitation strikes against Taiwan's political leadership. Satellite imagery has revealed that, at the Zurihe training base in Inner Mongolia, the PLA has constructed a full-scale replica of the presidential office in Taipei, using it to drill air assault and assassination teams for the specific task of eliminating the head of state. Should the island refuse to break, the conflict would move to its most perilous phase, the Joint Island Landing Campaign. This is the amphibious nightmare, an operation of such complexity that it makes the D-Day landings of World War II look simple by comparison. Taiwan is a natural fortress. Its east coast is a wall of cliffs, and its west coast is a maze of mudflats and urban sprawl. There are only a handful of locations suitable for a large-scale landing, known as the Red Beaches. These narrow strips of sand, located near cities like Taichung and Taoyuan, have been surveyed, pre-sighted by artillery, and prepared for demolition for decades. To bridge the Taiwan Strait, the People's Liberation Army faces a critical shortage of amphibious assault ships. To transport the estimated 300,000 to 1 million troops required to subdue the island, Beijing has integrated its civilian merchant fleet into its war machine. Hundreds of massive roll-on, roll-off ferries, normally used to transport cars and passengers, would be mobilized. Taipei is turning the island into a kill zone using asymmetric weapons that are mobile, concealable, and lethal. The cornerstone of this defense is a new generation of American-supplied drone technology. The defense package approved in late 2025 includes over 1,500 Altius 700M loitering munitions. These are not mere surveillance drones. The Altius 700M carries a heavy warhead capable of penetrating armor, has a range of 160 kilometers, and can loiter over the battlefield for 75 minutes seeking targets. Imagine autonomous swarms of these machines, coordinated by artificial intelligence, descending upon the slow-moving Chinese ferries in the strait, turning the invasion fleet into a burning graveyard. On the beaches themselves, the sand would be turned into a death trap minutes before the enemy arrives. The M136 volcano mine dispensing systems, mounted on trucks or helicopters, can scatter thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines across a landing zone in seconds. Hidden in the dense urban jungle and mountain tunnels are the highly mobile HIMARS launchers and Paladin self-propelled howitzers, ready to fire and move before Chinese counter-battery radar can track them. This layered defense is designed to buy time, to make the price of every meter of Taiwanese soil so exorbitantly high in blood that the invasion stalls. But Taiwan cannot survive alone. The intervention of the United States is the variable upon which the entire equation rests. The U.S. National Defense Strategy of 2026 reflects a pivot, prioritizing the defense of the Western Hemisphere, while maintaining a strategy of deterrence by denial in the Indo-Pacific. The American military faces the daunting challenge of piercing China's anti-access area denial bubble, a fortress of missiles designed to keep U.S. aircraft carriers thousands of miles away. To overcome this, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps have adopted distributed maritime operations and expeditionary advanced base operations. The days of concentrating power in a single, massive carrier strike group are fading. Instead, the U.S. forces would disperse, spreading out across the vastness of the ocean to complicate Chinese targeting while concentrating their lethal effects. Small, mobile units of U.S. Marines, stripped of their heavy tanks and armed with anti-ship missiles, would act as stand-in forces. They would covertly insert onto the small islands of the first island chain, from the Japanese Ryukyus down to the northern Philippines, effectively turning the archipelago into a gauntlet of missile batteries. These Marines would strike Chinese ships and vanish, operating constantly inside the enemy's weapons engagement zone. The technological backbone of this dispersed force is a new constellation of satellites developed by the Space Development Agency. The proliferated warfighter space architecture replaces the vulnerability of a few large satellites with hundreds of small, low Earth orbit satellites linked by lasers. This mesh network, known as the Tranche 1 layer, provides unbreakable, beyond line-of-sight targeting data, allowing a Marine on a remote island or a submarine deep underwater to receive real-time coordinates of a moving Chinese destroyer. The heavy lifting of the American counterattack would fall to the silent service and the bomber force. U.S. attack submarines, arguably the one domain where American dominance remains uncontested, would slip into the shallow, noisy waters of the Taiwan Strait. Using the acoustic chaos to mask their presence, they would wreak havoc on the Chinese transport fleet, torpedoing the troop carriers that are the lifeline of the invasion. Above, strategic bombers like the B-1, B-2, and the venerable B-52 would launch massive salvos of long-range anti-ship missiles and JASSMER cruise missiles from well outside the range of Chinese defenses. Software updates to these missiles have given them the ability to hunt moving ships, allowing the U.S. Air Force to generate a density of firepower that would overwhelm the air defense systems of the Chinese escort fleet. This operational plan is impossible without allies. The geopolitical map of the conflict highlights Japan and the Philippines as the critical anchors. Tokyo realizes that the fall of Taiwan would leave its own southern flank hopelessly exposed. To the south, the Philippines provides the necessary strategic depth. Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, Manila has granted the U.S. access to bases in the northern province of Cagayan, less than 100 miles from Taiwan. Here, the U.S. Army has deployed Typhoon missile batteries, capable of striking maritime targets in the Bashi Channel, a critical choke point. In a groundbreaking move, reports suggest Taiwan is indirectly funding the hardening of these Philippine bases, building concrete aircraft shelters and ammunition depots to ensure that when the missiles start flying, American reinforcements have a place to land. The grim reality of the conflict, as simulated in dozens of war games by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for a New American Security, is that there are no clean victories. In scenarios where the US and its allies successfully prevent the conquest of Taiwan, the cost is staggering. The United States could lose 2 aircraft carriers and hundreds of advanced aircraft, suffering more casualties in 3 weeks than in 2 decades of war in the Middle East. The backbone of the U.S. Navy and Air Force would be broken, ending the era of American global supremacy. Taiwan would be a ruin, its infrastructure pulverized, its economy dead, a liberated wasteland. The economic consequences of such a war would trigger a global depression unlike anything in history. The shock would exceed the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic combined. The immediate impact would be the shattering of the Silicon shield. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of the most advanced chips used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. The destruction of the TSMC foundries, whether by Chinese sabotage or as collateral damage, would stop assembly lines worldwide. The auto industry, big tech, medical manufacturing, and defense contractors would simply shut down. The financial war would be equally devastating. The G7 nations would likely impose maximum sanctions on China, freezing trillions of dollars in assets and cutting off major Chinese banks from the SWIFT system. But China is not Russia. Its economy is 10 times larger and deeply woven into the fabric of global finance. The retaliation in the panic would cause a sell-off of Chinese assets worth over $1 trillion, crashing markets from New York to London. Supply chains would snap instantly. Developing nations in Africa and Latin America, dependent on Chinese demand for their raw materials, would face economic collapse and sovereign default. There is also a darker, more radical theory regarding Taiwan's defense, known as the broken nest strategy. Some Western strategists have suggested that Taipei should make it credible that they will self-destruct their own semiconductor industry upon invasion, thereby rendering the island economically useless to Beijing. While controversial, it highlights the desperation inherent in the defense of the island. However, most analysis suggests that Xi Jinping's motivation is nationalistic and ideological, not economic. Meaning, the destruction of the chip factories would not deter him, but merely ensure that the prize he captures is one of ashes. As the smoke clears in the simulations, the result is often described as a Pyrrhic victory. The invasion fleet is sunk, the beaches are littered with the wreckage of thousands of vehicles, and the Chinese Communist Party faces a crisis of legitimacy that could lead to its collapse. But the world that emerges from the Taiwan Strait conflict is one of broken powers and shattered economies. The only way to avoid this catastrophe, the assessment concludes, is to make the prospect of invasion so terrifyingly difficult and costly that the order to attack is never given. Through the mass deployment of drones, the hardening of alliances, and the clear communication of resolve, the strategy is to convince Beijing that the red beaches of Taiwan are not a stepping stone to glory, but a graveyard for the Chinese dream.